All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Pencils and Lipstick. Today, I'm very excited to have Rhonda Douglas with me. She's a Canadian short story author, and she also helps us get those short stories out into the world and teaches writers about writing. So thank you, Rhonda, for coming on and talking with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have you here because for those of us who like writing short stories, your name is well
Mhm.
known. At least I know you and all my friends know you. So that
Thanks,
is the
Kat.
world, right? You're
A
famous.
great way to start the day.
Yeah. So could you just tell us a little bit about where you are from and
Mhm.
then we'll get into how you got into writing.
Yeah, sure. So I'm originally from Newfoundland, which, if anyone read the shipping news, is that place. But I've lived in Ottawa, Canada now since I came here to go to university.
Okay.
And that was a while ago. So I've mostly lived most of my adult life in Ottawa, Canada. But I'm originally from small fishing village in rural Newfoundland.
Oh my
So
goodness. So
yeah.
are you one of the writers that got started early? You knew like you liked books, you
Mm.
wanted to start writing, or how did you get
I
into
mean,
it?
I was one of those book crazy kids, like, Bobbsey twins,
Yes.
in kindergarten kind of reader. And so I've always been book obsessed. And then I can kind of put it to, I think I was about 9 years old, 8 or 9. And it was, we had one of those assignments at school, right?
Okay.
And write something about something. I don't even know what the assignment was, but I wrote something about my brother. My brother and I never really got on all that well, especially when we were super young, right? And so I wrote this little essay, about, and it's like half a page in my just learning how to write script, about my brother and how I loved him, but he really bugged me. And I got a gold star, and my mom has saved that. She's got like this
Really?
scrapbook of stuff,
Oh, that's
in the
awesome.
basement. Yeah. So that's the first thing I can remember. Sort of, you get that pat on the head and
Yeah.
the coveted gold star, and I think that's what did me in. My dad was an English teacher, so that
Okay.
probably didn't help. And then I was just book crazy. So like Bobbsey Twins, Trixie Belden, Nancy Drew, of course, Hardy Boys, when I ran out of Nancy Drew,
Yeah.
all that. So, and then I discovered Anne of Green Gables. And as a
Oh,
redhead, that was transformative, really. Like that, I still think that secretly I'm Anne of Green Gables.
yes.
So,
I just
so
talked
I
in my
think,
newsletter about how that was my favorite. That was my first box set. I
right?
was
Yeah,
love
I
those
just,
books.
loved it from Anne of Green Gables all the way through to, Anne of Avonlea. And
Yes.
um, so I think that's probably where I realized, oh, this is a thing, like
Hmm.
people do this. This is a way of being in the world. And so I was writing from definitely early teens. And then in my mid-teens, like junior high, I won a poetry contest.
Oh,
And and then I started winning other little things. I was like, oh, you can do this. And,
how
they'll
fun.
take you for a fancy dinner and you can win $500. And,
That's a
at
lot
the
of
time,
money.
yeah, I know, right? Like at the time, we're talking the mid 80s. So that was real
Oh,
cash.
I'd take 500 right now for
Yeah. Yeah, true. So, yeah, and also I think at the same time, so that there was a poem that won that award, but
Mhm.
at the same time, my grandfather was dying, and
Oh,
I wrote a poem for him, and took it to the hospital and read it to him, and I can still remember how moved he was. Like,
mhm.
that was really, um, I think, really a big moment in my life to realize like how much writing can convey and the power of writing. And
Right.
so I was definitely writing poetry a lot in my teens, and some of it was so bad. Like I have a journal that I've saved
Me too.
that I'm terrified, like I'm gonna have to burn it before I die. I'm terrified someone's gonna find it. It's all like
I know.
bad, bad, bad poetry about
Very
boys.
angsty.
So angsty. Oh, and it rhymes. Oh,
It's great.
yeah.
I don't know why, but there was a section of our class, I think it was sophomore year, in which they used structure. And now that I'm older, and they were like, yeah, you can do it in a different like structure on the page.
In
And
a
so it was like
shape.
in a
Yeah.
shape.
Yeah, write a poem about a tree, but shape it like a tree.
Yes, I have like
Yeah.
spirals and triangles, and stair steps
Yeah.
and things. And
Yeah.
it's very funny. I like
Did you
it.
keep them? Like, do you have your
I
old like
have
writing?
them. I have flipped through it, but I have not read. I have not read
Okay.
it. And yes, if any were, I can't bring myself to burn it though.
So I actually used it once in a short story. So I got started really doing short stories in my 20s, and then in my 30s I did a master's of fine arts. And the woman I was working with, I was writing a short story about basically about an angsty teenager who also
Yeah.
writes. I don't know where that idea from. Anyway, and so my mentor said like, "Ooh, do you have it? Like you mentioned the bad poetry. Do you have like any bad poetry you could put in here?" I was like, do I? I got lots. So I
That's
used it for
amazing.
a short story. Yeah.
I love that idea, actually. That's really good. You could do that. So when you're writing poetry, and I think a lot of people these days, um, I mean, I have interviewed a couple poets, but it seems like a hard thing to get into and to make a living out of. I think we
Oh,
still have that mindset. We don't really read it anymore, right? I mean, as a society,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a very obscure art form now.
Mm.
Like it's like meeting someone who says, "Oh yeah, I do opera." Like
Yes.
it's very obscure. More so. But it's so rewarding. Like at the
Yeah.
level of the word, if you're someone who loves words, the economy that's required in poetry, I think is really great training for editing a short story, for even working with the novel and working at the line level. um, and you want to have fresh verbs and fresh nouns, and write things that no one's seen before.
Yeah.
Poetry, right? Like I think it's really good training.
Yes. Yeah. And I think it's a great way to even explore your own feelings. Like, what are emotions?
Mm, yeah,
We're not really taught that. We're like
yeah,
happy, angry. He shrugged.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also observing the world, like
Mm,
the world of the poem is the world of the image,
right.
and we're so rushed, we don't slow down to observe the world. And so if you don't do that, how are you going to find the way to describe the look that crosses your main character's face?
Yeah.
Just that fleeting look that goes across their face in a conversation that they're having. Like, so poetry also, I think, is a really good way of observing the world around you. And that's I think that's probably, the language play, and then the observing, the fine observing, both in terms of what I'm thinking and feeling, but also what's happening around me, and in much finer detail
Mm,
than I ordinarily would. For me, that's what poetry gives me when I don't get a good poem out of it. Like, why do it if you're not able to
right.
like write the next great poem? And I hope to write one really, really good poem before I die. God knows I'm writing enough of them that, if volume can do it. um, but even without that, I think the practice of
Yeah.
poetry, and for me, it's almost, I would say it's almost a spiritual practice as well, just because it requires me to slow down, be still, do that observing. The space from which I write poetry, and this always feels a little woo-woo to me, and I don't mean it to sound that way, but like the space from which I write poetry is a very different space from the space from which I write fiction. I
Yeah, I
can
think
sit
so.
down in the morning. I could get off this with you and go and work on some fiction. I couldn't get off this with you and go work on poetry. I would have
Right.
to be still for a while. I would have to read some poetry. I have to settle my being
Hmm.
in a way that for some reason I don't with fiction.
That's true.
Weird.
That's true.
Yeah.
And I'm reading a book. I'm actually reading in French, so
Mhm.
I don't know what the name is in English, but it's written in the 50s.
Mm,
And the way that they play with language, the way that the
mm.
writer plays with language. Let me see. Yeah, it's Carlos Safron. So anyway, not well known in
Yeah.
the West,
Mhm.
but the way that he plays with language, you can tell that the writers in the past not only read a lot. So we can tell writers these days
Mhm.
read books, but they read poetry. They read in
Yes.
a
Yeah.
way that they
Yeah.
can play with words, and
Absolutely.
it's not overwhelming. Like there are some classics where we remember being a 15-year-old and being like, I have no idea what's going on in
I
this
don't know what that
sentence.
sentence was. Yeah.
But okay, it's not just tons of adjectives. It's like you said, it's
Mm.
the ability to say, what is moving in their eyes more than he shrugged or she squinted or
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of all the tropes I fall into, and then I
Yeah.
have to go back and edit them out.
Right.
What is that sound yet that you make when you're like, oh, I don't know. You don't want to
Yeah,
answer.
exactly.
It's very clear that they studied this more than
Yeah.
just read it, that
Yeah.
it stuck with them.
Yeah.
Um,
And poetry for me is a very it's an ongoing practice. So I'm always um trying to stay immersed in poetry and
mm,
writing poetry, even if, let's say, like I just finished the draft of a novel and I'm taking a break before I jump in to revise it. I don't really take a poetry break in the same way.
mhm.
I'm always engaged in poetry, and I feel like I'm constantly learning, constantly all the time, and I just want to learn more and do more with it. Um, and that's true for other areas of writing as well, but I don't know, there's just something about poetry, and I think some of it is that the stakes are so freaking low. Like you think about being an author generally, right? But with poetry, like it's only other poets who actually really read poetry. Some people go to it for inspiration, but
Mhm.
a very small group that you're talking to, like your audience is always going to be tiny. You're not going to, there's zero pressure to make a living. Zero.
Right.
Like I'm not wondering how my book is selling on Amazon,
Like
like,
marketing for
yeah.
poetry.
Yeah. So there's a lot of the pressure that, that
Yeah.
comes with being a writer is not there with poetry. And you can just engage with the art form for the sake of the art form
Oh,
in a
that's
way
nice.
that you can still do that. Of course, you can still do that with fiction and nonfiction, but the other stuff is harder to bat away, with
Mhm.
fiction and nonfiction. I find that the idea of the market is hard to escape. Whereas
Yeah.
with poetry, I think it's a little easier.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting too. I interviewed her name is Lenati, and she's from South Africa, and she
Mm,
writes poetry. And I think it's a really interesting and fairly accessible. You don't have to read a full novel,
yeah,
but you can get a taste of different
yeah,
cultures, how they write poetry, what they observe in the world.
yeah, mhm,
Because it's different from our Western eyes, and
yeah.
what
And
they're
I
immersed
love
in.
that. I just love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, all of our myths way back when, we put them all to
Mm,
rhythm, right? Because that's how we could remember
yeah.
them orally.
Yeah.
So I would I would always encourage people to pick up something new. But I do think you make a good
Mm,
point about practicing, that there's no pressure, but you
mm.
can even get off, just keeping the journal. You don't have to publish it.
No, exactly. I mean, to get to my first book of poetry, I wrote, so there's about 60 poems in that book.
Oh wow.
I had about 120 and deleted, like I probably deleted twice what's in the book. I haven't deleted them. They're somewhere. They're
Right.
probably on they're up in the clouds somewhere. Hopefully no one will see them ever, but they're there, and I have
Yeah.
the practice of writing them. So yeah, not everything needs to be published. Sometimes you can use poetry as a way to process something, as a way to
Hmm.
learn, as a way to observe. Doesn't all and I think that can be true for, I mean, the novel's a little different because you spend so much
So much
time at it, like
time.
the big projects, so much time.
Right.
So like it hurts when that doesn't get published.
Yeah.
But I
Deleting half
definitely
of
feel
that
that way about
novel.
short stories. Yeah, I feel that way about short stories though. Like you
Okay.
can write a short story that doesn't get published, so you're just playing around. Why
How
not?
did you get into short story writing?
Gosh, I think it's funny because I don't think I was reading a lot of short stories. I had read short
Hmm.
stories, but it was more through school. So um, I decided to do an English literature degree after, flapping around with other things. I think at one point I wanted to do politics or whatever. I don't know.
Oh, thank God.
So I finally settled on an English literature degree and ended up, reading some short stories through that and just
Hmm.
fell in love with the form. So that would have been
Okay.
in my mid 20s
Okay.
and started reading more. And then a lot of the workshops that I was able to take, I would say in my late 20s, I began taking workshops, writing workshops where I could. And a lot of them focused on the short story because
Okay.
it's easy to work in let's say over the period of an 8-week writing workshop, you can work on one or two stories in a way
Okay.
that it's harder to do with a novel. So,
Sure.
and I also was a single mother at the time. And so like I had no time.
Right.
So there was no way that a novel, it just didn't feel doable to me.
Right.
But short stories, and I just kind of got obsessed. And I started writing a lot of them. Um, I was in a writing group that was for a while. It's not the case now. We've been going for a long time in different iterations, but everyone was working on short stories.
Okay.
So it just felt natural. Like, we'd meet once a month and go through each other's short
Oh,
stories, and
fun.
that was so great. So it just kind of evolved that way, and I got into a graduate diploma program with someone who her name's Elizabeth Harbour, and she'd had like short stories in the New Yorker, and she had award-winning collections, and so I
Hmm.
worked with her on some short stories, and that was a bit of a shock. The first time like a real writer, you work with
Yes.
someone who really knows the form and you send them your precious little short stories and they tell you how boring they are. Oh, that was a bit of a
That,
shock, but yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
So what is it about short stories? Because I do think just like poetry, short stories used to
Mm,
be that way, that every writer who was serious wrote them, at least
right.
whether they practiced them.
Yeah.
You can go back and find short stories by well-known classic authors.
Yeah.
They would publish them in the newspaper. Like they had to make a
Yeah.
living, right? So they they
Right.
were they
Right.
were writing all the time. And we seem to have really left that behind. I mean,
Right.
I I don't see a lot of people spending the time writing short stories. So what is it about short stories you think that is worth looking into and maybe spending some
Mm,
time with?
yeah. Um, I mean, I love the power, the emotional power of a short story in 10, 12, 14 pages.
Mm,
Like how it can just gut you or illuminate some aspect of life in such a short amount of time. And my favorite short story writers, do that.
mhm.
So that's what I love about it. So I'm always trying to figure out with the form, what is it about that
Yep.
that such a short compressed space and amount of writing can have that impact on a reader. And I think the thing about it having kind of gone out of vogue, definitely if you folks, writers who consider themselves literary writers,
Mhm.
who have aspirations to be considered great, to
Mhm.
hit the canon or win the Booker or the Nobel Prize or the Pulitzer, those writers who want to be engaged in the conversation of so-called serious literature are still looking at short stories,
Mhm. Yes.
are still writing short stories. So that it is it's not quite as obscure as the poet, but it's
Right.
getting there. And the writers that back in the day, like in the day of Hemingway and Dorothy Parker and folks who were publishing either in newspapers or in journals, the New Yorker back when, they were able to live, right? Because you'd publish a short story in the New Yorker, and you'd get $2,000 or $3,000, and that was a lot of money. It's still a lot of money today, but outside of a very few spaces, like the New Yorker, there's nowhere else to make that kind of money. So you can't make a living on either poetry or short stories. If you look at any of the great poetry and short story practitioners today, they are not making a living with their writing. Like if the forms you love are poetry and short stories, you release the idea of writing. You can teach it and make a living, but you can't write it and make a living. The last short story that I published in a literary magazine, you know, top-notch Canadian award-winning literary magazine, for which I won a prize, $300 to publish it. Now, the prize was, you know, it's a literary contest. The prizes are usually, you know, $1,000, $1,500. So in the end, that makes it worth it if you win a prize, but not many of us are going to win a prize. It's hard enough to get published in those literary mags. So you can't make a living with it anymore. So I think, and the readership has shrunk as well. So I think that's why people don't spend the time on it. But I love the form, and I love also the elasticity of the form. Like there's the Alice Munro short story, and there's the George Saunders short story, and then, you know, they're different and they're doing different things. I mean, arguably those guys have something in common, but every writer's able to do something different with the form. And so I just feel like it's a really exciting form for that reason, in terms of, you know, what's possible to achieve. And also, if it fails, like let's say you're working on a short story and you just can't get it to go, oh, well, like it took you a weekend of compressed time, you know, like it wasn't 9 months of your life. Yeah. So, and also I think for writers generally, because they're relatively quick and easy to write, you can write a lot of them. And what you get is a lot of practice writing scenes. And if you don't know how to write a scene properly, you are not going to be able to successfully write a novel.
That is so true. That is very true. I think one of the hardest things about a short story is the ending. I think, and some of my fellow writers, short story writers, you know, they don't struggle with that. For me personally, it is the ending that leaves you satisfied. And just like in that floating space of like, with that character, standing there with them, because it doesn't have to be the end of a novel. You know, like it's not the everything has come together and we have to explain it. I really feel it's just like you're in this sort of space of like, okay, I like the end of this. Of course, you know that the life goes on of this character, whether fictional or non-fictional. And so I find that I struggle with that personally.
And I think the difference, you know, the short story ending is an open ending. Like the best short stories leave you've had an experience. This experience is now over. Whatever happened in the story has come to some form of resolution, but there's a sense of openness to that ending. Whereas with the novel, and particularly I think the commercial novel for sure, you know, you tying up all those threads. Because God forbid somebody finds a thread and the next thing you know, they're on Goodreads about this omen thread, you know?
Like, I'm going to write another one. I'm sorry. My mother still can't forgive Maria Dueñez for the time in between because she left the mother behind.
Oh, that's hard.
To her as a reader, she can't stand it, you know? It's so funny.
It's so funny how, you know, readers, because I'm a reader and I feel like I'm pretty forgiving, but I definitely have like thrown books across the room.
Yes, we do.
I have left books in the garbage at Heathrow. Like, I've had really strong reactions, but I've never gone online to complain about it, you know, like, and I've never like DM'd the author to tell them what a shitty book it was, or and that kind of stuff happens way more now. I feel especially for indie authors, I think get more of that. Like they get the nasty Goodreads review. They
Mhm.
get, people talking trash in Facebook groups or whatever.
Yeah,
And
I
like,
think the reviewers have made a business now of it, a
mm,
platform of themselves. And so now they really
mm,
think that they're,
mm.
who are those guys that would review movies, in the 80s and 90s, those two men, anyway, Ebert,
Oh, Ebert and Siskel and Ebert. Is it
Siskel and
Siskel?
Ebert. Yeah. So you know
Yeah.
how they used to rip it
Yeah.
apart?
Yeah,
It's like,
but you know who came to mind is those two guys from the Muppets sitting in the
yeah,
balcony. You said
yes,
that.
those guys.
That's who I think of. That's your Goodreads reviewers right there.
Yes, the
Yeah.
Muppets who are trying to
Yeah.
yeah, they're pretty harsh. Especially because these days you have to really go looking for teaching, right? Like
Mhm.
storytelling. The thing I love about writing and learning how to write better, the short story, is it's about storytelling. Like,
Yes.
and I feel like that is an art form that we're kind of not really focused on,
Yeah.
even as millions of books come out every year.
Yeah.
it's
That's right.
it's actual storytelling. There is a difference, and you might not be able to articulate when when you read it, throw the book in the trash. But
Yeah.
really, what's wrong with it is the storytelling.
The
There's
story
something
didn't
that
work.
doesn't go.
Exactly. Mhm.
Eh,
Or I would say there's the story that doesn't work, and then there's the inauthentic author
mm,
where I don't believe you. Like
oh,
you
that's
are
a good one.
trying to put words down on paper that say, because anytime, I think every author is doing this. The minute you pick up a pen, you're putting words on paper, you're saying, this is what life is like.
Yep.
And if I don't believe you and I think you're faking it,
Mm-hmm.
like this isn't truly your view of what life is like and you're just faking it, I have no patience for that. Like
That's
life's
interesting.
too short. I don't have
Yeah.
time for an inauthentic author.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
that's an emotional response too, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm not gonna
Totally.
spend my time
Mm.
writing a review on there, but there's something like I don't. Yeah, I can see that. Now I can list the books in my head. That's probably what my
Right. Yeah.
reaction
We
is.
won't name names, but we know them.
I won't name them. I won't say that. And it too, it depends on the reader,
Yes.
but with short storytelling, what I think what you said is very true, like how to write a scene, how to like
Mm,
follow through um this sort of story arc. Something's happening, the
mhm,
character is responding.
mhm,
And I also think it's a way that we might consider going back to this, because there are so many things happening in the world, and it's
mm,
so emotional, right?
mhm.
We know so much stuff.
Yeah.
And instead of processing through it or exploring a way to respond to it through a character, maybe put my shoes in somebody, on this side, what
Mhm.
would they see the world as? We just go to Twitter, like
Yeah.
rant and
That's right.
rave. But I
Yeah.
think it's a really interesting practice to bring, a character through something, and might even open our minds to like, oh, what would it be like to be, bombed over
Mhm,
here in this country and nobody cares,
mm,
but we care,
mm. Yeah.
just like exploring this, or, you know, putting your yourself in your neighbor's shoes if you don't get along with them. Or,
Right.
um, I wrote a short story about my reaction when I couldn't get my vacuum to work, and the chain supply and all this stuff.
Right. Right.
It's
Right.
just like, it's kind of silly, but it was a way to process through, like, what was I thinking? Like, I almost ended up with
Right.
3 vacuums because I didn't have a piece. But that was my thought process. Like,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
is wrong with you, cat? But
Yeah.
going through and like writing that through out was like, huh, this is interesting, my thought
Yeah.
process on on
Yeah.
this.
And I feel like every story does that. Every story says, um, here's a human having an experience, or here's a
Mhm.
group of humans having an experience.
Yeah.
And it invites us into that, and it expands our view of humanity. It expands our
Mhm.
view of life. So and in a short story, it's not a huge commitment, right? You can sit
Right.
down and read one in half an hour, put it aside, process it, and come back and pick up the book and read the next one when you're ready. So
Right. Right. I agree. I would love for indie authors to continue. And I think the workshops might be coming back, possibly,
yeah,
hopefully.
yeah,
Hopefully in
I just
person.
did an in-person workshop in
Ooh,
Manchester,
oh,
England. I was
fun.
there for my day job, and I had some students in the UK. So I said, hey, why don't we just do it? Well, like vaccinated and all the things, but let's just get together and do it in person. It was fantastic. It was like summer camp. It was so
Oh,
great.
nice.
Yeah. And I hope
Nice.
they come back soon too. Yeah.
Yeah, seeing humans and yes. So you have published your short stories and then
Yeah.
you do you have a novel out or is this the first novel that's
Yeah.
coming out?
I am just finished the draft of a historical mystery that I started at the start of the pandemic.
Oh my goodness. So
So,
you did write during the pandemic. Was
oh yeah, no, I
okay.
did. Yeah, I definitely did. So that I've just finished, and I'm taking a break, and then I've got to dive in and revise it because it's a holy mess, like every first draft. So my two published books are a book of poetry and a book of short stories, and then I have another manuscript of poetry I'm just finishing, and the novel that I just the draft that I just finished that I need to revise.
Yes,
So yeah,
you're
so
very
that's
busy.
mhm.
Um
Mhm. A
so
little bit.
so between writing, you also teach like you were just over in Manchester.
I do,
What
yeah.
how did you get into teaching writers?
So I was very active. I made a conscious and a very intentional choice
Mm-hmm.
to build up a literary life.
Okay.
So I looked around in my community, and I saw there were reading series, and where you can go and people come in from out of town and they read. There are writers festivals, and so I volunteered and I ran a reading series and all of that, and I just really became entrenched in a very intentional way in my local writing community.
Okay.
And so as a result of that, I guess, and of being known, and I was poetry editor for Canada's national poetry magazine, Art
Oh,
Poetry
okay.
Magazine, for a while. And so someone at the local library reached out to me and said, would you do a workshop, a poetry workshop?
Nice.
And I said, sure, okay, that sounds fun. I think there was a small honorarium, and then they did all the promotion and you just kind of showed up and did it. This was probably 15 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never taught until that point.
Oh, okay.
I had certainly done lots of workshops. And in my day job, I deliver workshops all the time. I work in international development. I do
Okay.
capacity building. So like workshops, I can
Easy.
pull a workshop together in a couple of hours. Workshops is almost like a second language for me. But I had never done a creative writing workshop. And
Okay.
I did that one for the library and I loved it so much. I could not, I remember after thinking, like, why didn't nobody tell me how much fun this was
Wow.
to engage with other
Yeah.
writers, in very specific ways about their work?
Yes.
Why didn't nobody say anything? Because all I had heard at that point is a lot of folks who taught creative writing did so to make a living, and all they did was complain. Like, I can't tell you how many people I knew who were teaching creative writing, and all they did was complain about their students. And I was like, wait, this isn't that. And then I realized it's because my students are not college students, they're not university students, they're
Yeah, they're
not
not
taking
forced.
credit, they're adults paying out of their own pocket,
Yes.
choosing to show up because they're
Right.
committed to their craft.
Right. They're
That's a
curious.
totally
Yeah.
different person, right?
Right.
So I teach those folks all day long.
Yes.
I love it. I just love it. So a couple of years ago, I decided, this is maybe 3 years ago, I decided to create my own course. And this actually came out of my experience with my master's program as well.
Okay.
So I did my master's of fine arts in creative writing at the University of British Columbia. And, you're in workshops with people who are so good,
Yeah.
so good. And you read their short stories and their novel excerpts, and you just realize, wow.
Yeah.
And then we graduate, and a couple of years go by, and I graduated in 2011.
Okay.
And then I realized that I would say only about 30% of folks who finished the MFA, maybe a little higher, but not by much, published a book. went on and published a book. And when I looked at it, and I looked at all of the writers I knew who I thought, frankly, were more talented than I was, like better writers than I was. And I looked at the folks who had not finished, whose stories I loved, and they were all women.
Mm.
And there's something about women not finishing books that I was really interested in. So I created a program called First Book Finish, that basically works with women to get you through the mindset aspects as well as the craft aspects of finishing that first book.
Right.
Because so many women just don't finish. They start lots, but then they don't finish. And there's all kinds of reasons for that.
Right.
But yeah, it really, really struck me. So that's the thing I'm most interested in. And that's why I teach, is to help women finish books and also have writing lives that they love.
Okay.
Like, why be miserable in your writing life?
Yes.
Like, it's not a badge of honor, to
Right.
like, oh, writing's so hard.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be like that. So
yeah, I think it's very interesting what you say about mindset, because that will affect so many things. Because even if you
absolutely.
finish your book, if you don't think it's worth the time you put into it because your mindset is still stuck in,
Yeah.
it's not good enough, whatever, we put everyone first.
Yes. Yes.
Everyone else is first. It's easier
Yeah.
for us to promote a friend's work than it is our own.
Yeah.
And so all of your mindset is so important.
It's
And two,
everything.
it's
Honestly, it's
everything.
everything. You
Yeah.
just you can write the best scenes in the world. You can have the greatest grasp of storytelling. If you can't get your mindset right to finish the damn thing, no one will ever know.
Right. Right.
Like it's everything. I really
Yeah.
can't say enough about how important it is. So I really wanted to create something in my teaching that addressed the mindset piece of it, as well as the craft. We all want to, writers love to talk about craft, right?
Right.
Like, I say, come, let's talk about dialogue. Yes, let's talk about dialogue. But perfectionism, self-doubt, self-sabotage. Why are you putting everybody first ahead of your writing dreams? What's that about, honey? Like, like
Yes.
we don't
Yes.
that stuff. That's a little harder. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of pressure these days. I would say even if you finish your book, if you don't feel like publishing it, it's still a
Mm.
huge feat to have
Oh yeah.
finished. It's
Oh
just,
yeah.
it's huge. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to go along with all of the things, that,
Right. Yeah.
and bringing out a novel every month. I have a issue
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah. I'm in some writing groups where I just lurk, that are
Oh, dear.
indie authors who are trying to make a living from their writing.
Yeah.
And that is I think it's really important for everyone to have their own definition of success. What is going to be a rich and rewarding writing life for you when you're on your
Right.
deathbed and you look back at your life? What do you want to have experienced?
Right.
And that's going to be different for everyone. And some writers are happy to be on the treadmill of getting out a book this month, getting out a book next month, working 6 months ahead on my Christmas novella, all that stuff.
Yep.
They're happy to do it, and that's the writing life that they want. Other people, they're going to be happy to have written the poem for their grandfather.
Yep. Yes. And I think what mindset is everything on that one.
Yeah.
It like you said, it's knowing what kind of author you are, of what kind of writer you are, what will make you happy, setting those success goals, whether it's finishing, publishing, whatever that is, and then not falling prey.
Yeah, not falling prey, like really standing in your own self and knowing yourself and standing in it. But at the same time, I think they're not being rigid about it for either. Like, I can think of a time in my writing life, probably a decade ago. Well, I was a serious writer. I was a very serious writer. I was writing serious things about serious subjects, and there's a point at which that just got boring, because what was happening is I was reading all these really great books on the side, like I had reading my literary fiction, who won the Booker this year. Okay, I bought that one. That one's sitting in a pile. Meanwhile, I'm burning through this mystery series, like as a reader, I'm like, woo, let me read more of that. So I think that self-publishing and, indie publishing has completely transformed what's possible for a writer's life.
Yeah.
And that's exciting. Like, it's a bit of it is crazy, right? Like, if you feel like you're on the treadmill and it's the book a month in order to, be the breadwinner for your family, and you can make that work, and that's what you want to do. Amen, sister, like, go for it. But I think the great thing that it's done is opened it up. Like, I've got a few students now who are at the querying stage. So they're researching agents and sending queries out to agents. And they're going to try the traditional publishing route. And then if that doesn't work, they can still get their book out into the world.
That's what's
great
about it.
Yeah, they might even do better. They certainly will have more control, right? Like, they'll get the cover they want. But so everything is possible now. And in that way, it's almost more important to know yourself and to know what is going to make for a rich and rewarding writing life that you can create for yourself and sustain over time.
Yes. And I think going back to mindset too, like you said, they're doing the querying phase. That's tough.
That's a hard
very
phase.
tough.
Yeah.
I went indie because I lived over in France and I kept querying, and it got overwhelming, honestly. And back in 2010, there was like writersdigest.com.
Right. Not much else. Yeah.
Not much else. I just didn't stumble onto any of the forums. But what indie writing, you're going to get the Goodreads reviewers. So your mindsets of renewing, and having those friends, that community. I mean, I got this scathing review I had sent in a book, and I really had to step back and remember, oh no, you actually there are people who like this.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing too. Like, there's a book for everyone. Like, there is a book in the world for everyone, and there's someone who needs the book that you're writing right now. I do believe that, but also we're not for everyone. And so there are going to be people who hate your book and leave it in a trash can in Heathrow. Like that, the book that I left in a trash can in Heathrow won a Pulitzer, won a National Book Award. And I just thought, like, nope, it was not for me. No, I'm not naming names, but it was not for me. I was not the reader. Hopefully someone rescued it from the trash can and it found its reader, but it annoyed me.
Right.
Right. So I'm not that reader. Now, I didn't go trashing on Goodreads because karma, baby. But that is so true, that art is objective and there's something for everyone, and you will not be for everyone. And so don't beat yourself up when, 5 people on Amazon or Goodreads decide, misread, because often also those reviews are like, did you read it? Because that's not what's going on. So, don't get caught up in the stupid. And the more you know yourself and what really matters for you, the more, the easier that is not to get caught up in the stupid.
Right. And that's why I do like to encourage people to find those groups like you have, if you want to, because those are going to be friends for life. They're going to encourage you. They've been through it.
Community. So important.
Build you back up and throughout the process, learn how to take critiques and reviews and all
of that. And also, like, often writers get agents through other writer friends.
True.
Right. Or they learn, somebody says, I was talking to so-and-so and they run a writing festival and they're looking for this kind of book. So I mentioned yours.
Ooh.
Like, it's a small little community and we have to help each other out.
Yes. And when you have the right mindset, you want to do that, right? You not only value your friend, but you value yourself. And so I love that. Do you have your workshop? Is it open all the time, or are there certain times throughout the year? Do people need to get on a mailing list to find out about
so
it?
First book finish, I do a couple times a year.
Okay.
So people can get on the waiting list for that because it'll be later this year. And
Okay.
I don't have a firm date yet. That particular program, I give so much to it that I
Mhm.
really can only run it a couple of times a year
Right.
because it takes like a chunk of my heart every time. Um,
So it's not just
and
a
then
video course. It is like live.
yeah, no,
You're working with people.
it's deep. It's like live weekly coaching,
Okay.
critiques. It's the full meal deal. I have another program called the Writers Flow Studio.
Okay.
So this is a monthly membership for writers who want to go from like a state of fear and anxiety
Mhm.
to a state of flow. And
Ooh,
so
I like
it
that.
tends to be writers who have struggled with mindset, who and have found it getting in the way of consistent practice. And so we do like live monthly mindset master classes. We
Fun.
do community writing sessions. We have visiting writers come in to talk about craft. So
Okay.
that's open all the time. And you can find more information about that on my website at resilientwriters.com.
Resilientwriters.com. Okay. I'll have that. RhondaDouglas.com. You have, and then I'll have resilientwriters.com.
Yeah, resilientwriters.com is the site. So by the time this is live, it'll be there, but I'm transitioning from rhondadouglas.com to resilientwriters.com.
Right.
So
Just
yeah,
as we were talking before, there are so many steps and so many things to
there's
do.
so many things, all the things.
So many things. So I want to stress for people to go to rhondadouglas.com. I was talking about this with my other writing group. You have a great blog post on how to enter and possibly win Lit Mag contest, but you have some really great blog posts about writing that will really open, I think, people's mind and ideas to short
Yeah.
story, but also just, a different part of writing if they're kind of in
Mhm.
the grind of indie novel churning.
Yeah, there's a whole series I did on entering literary contests, how to
Mhm.
research them, how to go about entering them, and just also outside of contests, getting published in literary magazines, which is where you would publish the short story. And there's definitely,
Right.
lots of stories of folks who got agents
Yes.
through publishing a short story.
Yes. Ross McMeekin, who was on the show a few months
Mhm.
ago, he got his agent through there. So it's definitely something to think about. It is not a waste of time, as I have been told by a few people. No, it opens up the doors. And like you said, it's finding community, it's networking with different people and across the world. But I will have the links in the show notes.
Great.
But thank you so much, Rhonda, for coming on and talking to us about poetry and short stories and the work that you're doing with writers.
Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. So it was lovely to meet you, Kat, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
Yes.